I need to tell you about something I noticed in a cathedral last year that I can't explain. Not the stained glass, not the vaulted ceilings, the organ. Specifically, what was underneath it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a building in almost every major city across North America and Europe that shouldn't exist. Not according to the official timeline, not given the resources these cities supposedly had when they were built. We call them cathedrals, civic buildings, exhibition halls, massive stone structures with features so technically sophisticated that modern engineers struggle to replicate them even with today's technology. And here's what nobody talks about. They all appeared within the same narrow window of time, roughly 1850 to 1915, across continents, in cities that were by official record frontier towns or colonial outposts just decades before. The standard explanation involves rapid industrialization, ambitious civic planning, waves of skilled European craftsmen immigrating to the New World. It's a neat story. It requires you to not look too closely at the details. Because when you actually examine these structures with fresh eyes, the timeline dissolves, the resource requirements become impossible, and the architectural features start revealing purposes we're not supposed to notice. Let me show you what I mean. Pick any major cathedral or civic building constructed between 1870 and 1900. Look at the foundation, not the facade, the foundation. You'll notice something strange. The base level, what should be the ground floor, often sits below current street level. Sometimes by a few feet, sometimes by an entire story. Windows that should provide light to ground floor rooms are now half buried, opening into darkness below the pavement. The official explanation is sediment buildup, street level rising naturally over time through construction and repaving. Except that doesn't explain the finished quality of those buried spaces. These aren't rough basements or utility areas. They're completed rooms with plastered walls, detailed moulding, finished floors, spaces that were clearly designed to be inhabited, to be seen to be used at ground level, and they're buried, not partially, completely, as if something came and covered them, as if the street level rose not gradually over centuries, but rapidly. All at once. But that's just the beginning. The foundation anomaly is visible, documentable. What I want to talk about is what you can't see from the street. The features that only become apparent when you're inside, when you start noticing patterns that repeat across buildings separated by thousands of miles, built supposedly by different architects for different purposes, with no communication between them. Start with the acoustics. Every major cathedral, opera house, civic hall from this period has acoustic properties that modern sound engineers describe as perfect. Not good, perfect. The mathematics of sound reflection, the angles of walls and ceilings, the material composition, the spatial geometry, it all works together in ways that shouldn't be possible without computer modelling. Because the mathematics required to calculate these acoustic properties weren't formalised until the 20th century. Yet buildings from the 1870s demonstrate mastery of principles that weren't supposedly understood yet. The standard response is trial and error, architectural intuition, lucky accidents repeated across thousands of buildings. You start to notice how often the official explanation requires remarkable coincidences. Then there's the electrical system problem, and this is where things get strange in a way that's hard to dismiss. Many of these buildings, particularly the larger cathedrals and exhibition halls, have electrical conduit systems built into their walls, not added later, built in, integrated into the original construction. Channels and passages running through stone walls, perfectly sized for electrical wiring, with access points and junction boxes positioned exactly where you'd want them for a building-wide electrical grid. Here's the issue. Most of these buildings predate widespread electrical infrastructure. They were supposedly built when gaslighting was still standard, when electricity was a laboratory curiosity, when Edison hadn't yet opened his first power station. Yet the architecture anticipates it. The walls contain spaces for something that didn't officially exist yet. Unless it did. Unless these buildings weren't built in the 1870s. Unless they were already there. I know how that sounds. I spent months trying to find conventional explanations before I let myself consider the alternative. But the evidence kept accumulating. the buried ground floors, the impossible acoustics, the pre-installed electrical infrastructure, and then there are the pipe organs. This is what I was examining when I found the feature I mentioned at the start. Pipe organs in these cathedrals aren't just musical instruments. They're massive mechanical systems, some weighing hundreds of tons, with thousands of pipes, complex air pressure systems, intricate mechanical linkages. The official story says they were installed during or shortly after construction. But when you look underneath them, when you examine the foundations and support structures, you find something troubling. The organ foundations are integrated into the building's structural system, not added, integrated. The support columns, the weight distribution, the acoustic chambers, they're all part of the original architecture, which means the building was designed around the organ, which means the organ was planned before construction began, which raises a simple question. Why would you design a massive structural system to support a specific pipe organ before you'd built the building or acquired the organ? Unless the organ was already there, unless the building was constructed around something that already existed, or unless both the building and the organ came from the same source, built at the same time by the same hands for purposes we're no longer told about. I started documenting these features systematically. The buried floors, the acoustic perfection, the electrical infrastructure, the integrated organ systems. And I found they weren't isolated anomalies, they were patterns, repeating patterns across hundreds of buildings. San Francisco to St. Petersburg, Melbourne to Montreal. Different architects, different stated purposes, identical unexplained features. Then I found the frequency problem, and that's when everything shifted. The pipe organs weren't just sitting there, they were active. Not mechanically, I mean something else. When I started measuring electromagnetic readings around these structures, I found patterns that made no sense. Specific frequencies clustering around 432 Hz. Harmonic resonances in the building materials themselves. Stone shouldn't do this. Limestone, granite, marble, they're not supposed to generate or amplify specific frequencies. They're inert. Dead matter. But these buildings weren't behaving like dead matter. I brought a frequency analyzer to 5 different cathedrals across 3 countries, same results. The walls, particularly around the organ chambers, showed residual resonance signatures, not ambient noise from traffic or HVAC systems, distinct tonal frequencies embedded in the structure itself, as if the building had been tuned like an instrument. Which, I started to realize, maybe it had been. There's a concept in physics called cymatics, sound waves creating geometric patterns in physical matter. You've probably seen those videos where sand on a metal plate arranges itself into perfect symmetrical designs when specific frequencies are played. That's cymatics, shape emerging from vibration. Now consider what happens if you scale that up. If you build a structure designed to resonate at specific frequencies, you're not just making a building, you're making a machine. A machine that does what exactly? That's what kept me awake. The deeper I went, the more I found references, buried in old technical documents and architectural surveys, to these buildings having unusual effects on people inside them. Not psychological, physiological, accounts from the 1800s describing how certain cathedrals made visitors feel energized or calm, how specific rooms in exhibition halls seemed to improve focus or induce deep relaxation. The modern explanation is atmosphere, architectural grandeur creating emotional responses. But what if it wasn't emotional? What if these buildings were generating measurable effects through frequency? I started looking at the dimensions again, not aesthetically this time, mathematically. The ratios weren't arbitrary. Floor to ceiling heights, wall thicknesses, chamber volumes, they all related to wavelength calculations for specific frequencies. This wasn't architecture designed to look impressive. This was architecture designed to function, to resonate, to generate or amplify something we're no longer told about. Which brings me back to the electrical infrastructure. Those channels in the walls, those pre-installed conduits, what if they weren't for lighting? What if they were for something else? Distribution systems for energy we've been told didn't exist yet. Or maybe energy we've been told never existed at all. I know this sounds like I'm drifting into speculation. Stay with me, because there's one more pattern that makes all of this harder to dismiss. The timing. These buildings, These cathedrals and exhibition halls and civic centres, they all appear in the historical record within a very specific window, roughly 1850 to 1915. That's it. Before 1850, almost nothing. After 1915, the style completely changes. Art Deco, modernism, brutalism, everything shifts. The classical revival just stops. Why? The standard answer is changing tastes, new architectural movements, technological progress, but architectural styles don't usually stop that abruptly. They evolve, they blend, they leave remnants. This didn't evolve, it just ended. Like someone flipped a switch. 1915, that date kept appearing. Right at the edge of World War I, right before everything we think of as the modern era begins, and right after something else happened that we don't talk about much. The 1910s saw a massive global push to standardize electrical systems, to establish power grids, to convert cities to centralized power generation. Before that, electrical systems were fragmented, localized, experimental. After that, they were unified, controlled, regulated. What if the old buildings, the ones with the built-in conduits and the resonant frequencies, what if they were part of a different system? A decentralized system, something that didn't require coal or oil or massive generating plants, something that pulled energy from somewhere else? I started finding references to atmospheric energy collection, to telluric currents, to systems that were supposedly theoretical but that had been built and tested in the late 1800s. Nikola Tesla's work kept coming up. His wireless power transmission experiments, his claims about being able to draw unlimited energy from the atmosphere, claims that were dismissed, buried, or classified. And then I found something in an old engineering journal from 1908, a technical description of a cathedral renovation in Prague. The workers had removed sections of the organ chamber and found behind the walls a network of copper coils wound in specific geometric patterns connected to ground rods extending deep into the earth. The article described it as an old lightning protection system. Outdated, insufficient, removed and replaced with modern grounding. But the configuration didn't match lightning protection. It matched Tesla's atmospheric energy collector designs, the ones that were supposedly never built. I went back through the renovation records I could find for other buildings. Same thing. Copper coil systems removed in the early 1900s. Always described as old safety equipment, always replaced with standard modern electrical infrastructure. What if it wasn't safety equipment? What if it was the original power system? What if these buildings were designed to collect and distribute energy wirelessly? And what if that entire technological approach was systematically dismantled and replaced with something that required fuel, required infrastructure, required control? That would explain the electrical conduits built into 1870s walls. That would explain the frequency tuning. That would explain why the style stopped so abruptly after 1915. Because they weren't building new ones anymore. They were converting the old ones, ripping out the guts and installing the systems we still use today. And it would explain one more thing, why there are no construction records. Because if you're not building, if you're inheriting, if you're repurposing, you don't need construction documentation, you need renovation records, which is exactly what we have. Endless renovation records from the early 1900s, buildings being modernized, updated, converted. From what? That question is never answered, just old systems being replaced with new ones. Don't worry about what was there before, so what am I actually saying here? That these buildings were power plants? That's not quite right, more like receivers. Nodes in a network that we can't see anymore because the network was deliberately shut down. And here's where the timeline gets uncomfortable. 1914, World War I begins. The first truly industrial war. The first war where oil becomes a strategic resource. The first war where centralized power generation becomes militarily critical. 1915, the architectural style stops. The buildings stop going up. Or more accurately, the conversions accelerate. 1920s, the electrical grid expands rapidly across the developed world. Standardized systems, centralized generation, fossil fuel dependence locked in. What if the war wasn't just about territory? What if it was about infrastructure, about controlling the energy systems that would define the next century? If there was a competing system, a decentralized system that didn't require fuel monopolies, that would be a problem that needed to be solved before the modern industrial economy could be established. I found a patent from 1912, filed by an engineer whose name I won't mention because I don't need that kind of attention. The patent described a method for neutralizing atmospheric energy collection systems, specifically targeting the resonant frequency configurations found in large masonry structures. The language was technical, buried in electrical engineering jargon, but the function was clear. It was a jamming system, designed to disrupt wireless power transmission. The patent was approved, then classified, then the engineer disappeared from the public record. No more patents, no more publications. Just gone. That's not normal. Engineers don't just vanish mid-career unless something makes them vanish. I started mapping the buildings I'd documented, the ones with the electrical signatures, the frequency tuning, the architectural DNA that didn't match the official narrative. And I noticed something. They cluster, not randomly. They form geometric patterns, lines connecting multiple structures across cities, triangulation points, grid nodes, like they were positioned intentionally, like they were part of a designed network. In Prague, I could trace a line connecting 7 major buildings, all constructed between 1870 and 1910. All with the same subterranean copper coil systems, all renovated and modernized between 1912 and 1920. The line they formed wasn't random. It aligned with the old city's ley lines, the traditional energy geography that medieval builders supposedly paid attention to. Superstition, we're told? Mysticism? Pre-scientific thinking? But what if it wasn't superstition? What if they knew something about telluric currents, about Earth's electromagnetic field, about energy transmission that we've forgotten, or that we've been made to forget? Tesla knew. He talked about it openly until the funding dried up and the ridicule started. Then he stopped talking. But he didn't stop working. His later patents, the ones filed in the 1920s and 30s, are weirdly specific about things that shouldn't have been relevant. Resonant frequency dampening, electromagnetic interference mitigation, systems for protecting against atmospheric energy disruption. Protecting against what? If the technology didn't exist, why would you need protection from it? Unless it did exist, and someone was actively suppressing it. The more I looked, the more the pattern held. Every major city had these buildings. Every major city had the same renovation timeline. Every major city saw the old systems removed and replaced right around World War I. And every major city's electrical grid expanded massively in the 1920s, locking in dependence on centralized power generation. The coordination is too perfect. The timing is too precise. This wasn't organic technological evolution. This was systematic replacement. And the buildings themselves, the ones that survived, they're still there, still resonating, still tuned to frequencies that serve no modern purpose. You can measure it if you know what to look for. The walls hum at specific pitches, the metal components vibrate at harmonic intervals. The structures themselves are instruments tuned and ready, but the signal they were built to receive isn't broadcasting anymore. Or maybe it is, and we just don't know how to listen. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm saying the questions aren't being asked. Why did a specific architectural approach appear globally, simultaneously, with no clear origin point? Why did it stop abruptly after 1915? Why are there no construction records but extensive renovation records? Why do these buildings have embedded electrical systems that predate the electrical grid? Why were copper coil networks removed and classified as outdated safety equipment? And why, this is the question that keeps me up at night, why does mainstream history have no curiosity about any of this? The official story is simple: industrial revolution, architectural fashion, progress. But that story requires us to ignore the physical evidence built into the structures themselves. It requires us to dismiss the electromagnetic signatures as coincidence. It requires us to accept that a global building phenomenon appeared and disappeared within 50 years for no particular reason. I don't accept that, and I don't think you should either. Because if these buildings were part of a different energy system, if that system was deliberately dismantled, if the knowledge was suppressed, then we're living in a world built on erasure. A world where the infrastructure we depend on isn't the only option. It's just the option we were given after the alternative was destroyed. The architecture is still there. The evidence is standing on street corners in every major city. The frequencies are still measurable. The patterns are still visible. We just have to be willing to look and to ask why we were told not to. I went back to that cathedral last month, the one where I first found the copper coils beneath the organ. They're doing renovations again. Updating the electrical systems, they said. Modernising for the 21st century. I watched them remove panels from the walls. Same thing. More coil configurations, more geometric patterns in the metalwork. The foreman called it old wiring, outdated infrastructure. But I'd brought my frequency analyzer. Before they disconnected everything, I got readings. The same 432 Hertz signature, the same harmonic resonances. They ripped it out and loaded it into a dumpster. Nobody asked what it was for. Nobody documented the configuration. Nobody seemed to think it was strange that a cathedral built in 1887 had a sophisticated electromagnetic system embedded in its walls. Just old stuff. Time to upgrade. That's how it works. Not through dramatic suppression or obvious censorship. Just through casual dismissal, through renovation and modernisation, through the slow, steady replacement of one system with another until nobody remembers there was ever an alternative. The buildings are still standing. The evidence is still there for now, but every renovation removes a little more. Every modernisation erases another piece, and every time someone asks questions, they're met with the same response. Outdated, irrelevant, already explained. Except it hasn't been explained. Not really, and the questions remain. What were these buildings actually for? What system were they part of? And who decided we weren't supposed to know? I can't answer those questions definitively. But I can tell you this. The architecture doesn't lie. The physics don't lie. The patterns don't lie. Something was built into these structures that we're not being told about. Something that worked, that functioned, that served a purpose beyond what the plaques and tour guides describe. And it's disappearing. Piece by piece, renovation by renovation. Maybe that's inevitable. Maybe progress requires leaving old systems behind, or maybe we're dismantling something we might have needed. Something that offered possibilities we've been taught not to.